So I'm wrapping up this week a 3-week study that I've been talking about, just kind of a temporary thing to fill in time while Brent was away. And then Brent got back kind of in the middle of the night and then had to still drive another 3.5-4 hours to get home. So Brent's going to be back in Job again starting next week. And then Jared is going to cover me for preaching. We're off to camp. So we're coming and going a lot this month especially. July is just our busy month, but then it's like the plug gets pulled out of that, and then it should theoretically be easy going in August. Theoretically. We've been talking about kind of the healthy churches in 2022. And I know there is a lot of bad news out there for churches. And I didn't really want to focus on that because it gets really discouraging and it's deflating and it's not motivating, and the church is anything but doomed. And I think it's so easy to get that feeling that the church is suffering, the church is dying, that Christianity is in this free fall. And we look at those statistics and what's going on in the church, and it's so easy to just throw our hands up in the air and say, okay, we're done. But I don't think that's the right answer. And so I hope you guys are really encouraged by this, and I hope there's some motivation too for us to be able to act and get into our community. So just kind of as a cap for those who weren't here, we talked about demographics in Somerset specifically the first week. Some of the demographics are really interesting. We have like kind of this strange conglomeration of poverty. We have a really dramatic increase in foster children in Somerset County since 2016 to current day. We have doubled the number of foster children in Somerset County. We already had a major shortage of foster families, which means that many of these children are displaced. We're actually shipping some of these kids out of state to place them in foster homes because we don't have any, not only in our county, but in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so our system is really struggling. It's overburdened. And some of these kids, especially when you have multiple siblings, are being sent to other states to live with families because the goal is to keep the siblings together. To separate them is an absolute last resort. So that's kind of a big issue. Religion, interestingly, Somerset County is the 3rd most religious county in the whole state of Pennsylvania. That kind of surprised me a little bit. Yet, I forget what the percentage was, but it's somewhere around 50% or more of the residents in Somerset County identify as non-religious. There's no religious affiliation whatsoever. So in the 3rd most religious community or county, we still have over 50% of our population that's not religious at all. For me, that's not a depressing statistic. That, especially in light of today's study, I think this is really encouraging and really hopeful. Not that people are dying who are lost, but that there are lost people to reach. And it's not that they're shut off to religion, it's that Christians are not evangelizing. So I wanted to show you guys this article by Carrie Nieuwhof. He wrote this. It's not date stamped, but based on the language, it looks like he wrote this at the end of 2021. So let's see how well this has aged. We're now 7 months into 2022, and he gives these predictions at the end of each year. And so he gave 12 disruptive church trends that will rule 2022. Let's find out how he did. I like Carrie Nieuwhof's material. I think he and Tom Rainer are probably the top 2 people, in my opinion, who have a good finger on the pulse of what's going on in the church in America. So he said, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but having been through 2 excruciating years as a church leader, what can you expect in 2022? As you can see by the sheer number of trends, the most I've covered in my annual trend series, 2022 is shaping up to be a pivotal year. A new reality will emerge, and it will be different than we think. The last few years have been necessarily characterized by a very narrow focus. In other words, we were all kind of caught up in the pandemic. Our focus got really narrow. A lot of churches were in survival mode. And so he's saying, based on that, let's see how we're going to break out of this. Here are some of the questions. Can we reopen? And if so, how? Who's coming? Who's not coming? Online or digital? Is hybrid the future? So a combination of online and in-service. Masks or no masks, vaccines or no vaccines, Democrat or Republican. These were big issues that were facing the church. So we'll just jump right into his trends, what he sees, what he saw as coming up in 2022. Number one, the demise of the old model of church. Every church and every leader has a model of church. Even those who claim they don't have a model, have a model. Their anti-model is the model. A model is simply an approach, a strategy, a way of doing things. The old model of church has been proving less effective year by year for decades across almost all denominations and traditions. And that model is the 1 hour, 4 walls of the church. We focus all our time and energy and money on that, what happens at that 1 hour. So it's it's the big bands. It's the, thousands of, or tens of thousands of dollars of lights, stage lights. It's the building projects. It's, we put all of our focus. It's the pageants on Easter. It put all of our focus on that 1 hour. That's the old model, and he's saying that model was effective for a time. It's not anymore. That model was, if you build it, they will come. It's no longer effective. It's not reaching people. In fact, people are wanting to get away from the glamour of these big, massive productions for Sunday. He shows a declining median worship attendance among congregations. Certainly it sunk since 2000. The average median from 137 to, in 2020, 65, and it's actually lower than that now. The current approach to church not only isn't effective, it hasn't been effective for decades, yet leaders keep moving forward as though somehow things are going to turn around. Optimism is one thing, delusion is another. I like that saying. I think he's spot on. So what he's saying is that there's a new model that's being rebuilt right now. And I like what he says here. The key is to experiment. I actually think that's a very wise thing to do. It can be really frustrating because you're going to experience massive failures along the way. Massive failure, colossal failures. But you adapt. Adaptability is the word of the day. If we as Christians cannot adapt, we will sink. We won't make it. So he's saying the trend coming into 2022 is to be adaptable, to experiment. Stay faithful to biblical principles. Experiment with the practice, not with the doctrine. Experiment with the practice. Study your people. Study the culture. Lead people where they need to go. Number two, he sees this trend. Growing churches will innovate beyond weekend services. As leaders rethink the model of church, more church leaders will start rethinking the role of the weekend services. Don't get me wrong. Weekend services are extremely important for a host of theological reasons and practical ones as well. So again, he's not saying abandon your theology and stop worshiping on Sunday and just start, having these random worship services. He's not saying that at all. What he's saying is for many churches, the weekend service has become either all the church does or the main focal point by which everything else revolves. Focusing all your efforts on 1 hour Sunday ignores the other 167 hours in a week. Well said. So what he's saying is these churches in 2022 are going to break out of that 1 hour system, and they're going to find other ways to be innovative and to reach people outside of that 1 hour worship service. Number three, the vision for the future will become clearer. That's another thing too. This is my opinion, and this is not a negative thing, so don't hear it that way. I do believe that our church right now, where we stand, is probably in survival mode. That means that in the next probably less than 5 years, will determine whether this church remains open or closes its doors. That's not a bad thing. What survival mode does, and I just mentioned it with my sister. My sister was in full-on survival mode. A little over a month ago, we had everybody fly in, and they were literally walking into her room saying their final goodbyes to her. She had 48 hours maximum that every doctor gave her to live. It was an impossibility for her to live beyond that 48-hour mark. Tex, I still remember the story that you told when you walked into a room and this boy said, well, the doctors give me, 6 months. And you said, they're doctors. They don't know. God knows, and God will determine what's going to happen with your life. And stepping into that faith and especially being in that survival mode will do one of two things for people. It'll cause them to give up hope and throw in the towel, or it will cause them to fight. And every successful business person that I know lived in a long period of survival. They fought their way out of that survival mode, and it made things become so clear about what matters and what doesn't. And so the things that didn't matter, in order to survive, and by survive, I mean they had to put a meal on the table for their family. They had to provide shelter for their family, and what they were doing wasn't cutting it. And so that survival mode forced them to rethink the future, not to anticipate or to worry about what happened in the past, but to focus on the future and say, what happened in the past really doesn't matter right now. I can't jump in a time machine and go back in time, which is what the sermon is about today. We can't look back. We can't go back in time. So we focus on the future and we look at these opportunities. And so the vision for the future will become much clearer. And I think that that's such a positive thing. And quite honestly, I think this congregation in particular, I think has the resilience to be able to do that. To be able to break out of survival mode and move into thriving mode. I honest to goodness think that, or I wouldn't be here. I would not be standing here if I didn't believe that that's quite possible. Number 4, attendance will normalize and you'll have a new church. Boy, that's powerful, isn't it? I think we've seen that. I think attendance has pretty much normalized here. It's settled on a pretty low, low mark, which is normal for most churches. There's a whole host of reasons why people didn't come back. And we found out that we have kind of a new church. When we look around and see who's left, I don't see anybody who's half-hearted who's here. I don't see anybody propping their feet up being like, well, we're just going to kind of do our thing. I don't see that here. And so that's a positive thing. Attendance is normalized and now we have a new church. 2021 had many leaders clinging to the idea that next season, Easter, the new school year, Christmas, etc., would bring attendance back to 2019 levels, which wasn't that great in the first place. For most churches, that magic season never materialized. In 2022, the constant cycle of hope and disappointment will give way to the new reality that this is your church. I don't know if you guys feel that. I don't hold out this hope that we're going to get all these people that used to come here. They're going to come back and it's going to be this big euphoric, utopia, and life will go back the way it was, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. It's not a reality. And so the reality is we have a new church who's incredibly dedicated, who's here, they're present, and we can have a vision for the future. Number 5, hybrid church will simply become church. Remember that whole Do we really go full force with online streaming? What does that mean? Will people drop off from here and just do live streaming instead of here? Like, those were questions that we all were asking. And now he's saying hybrid church just is now church. We're doing both, and we've kind of settled in on that, and we're reaching people online. Some of you online can't physically be here in person, but yet you're here week after week after week. Some of you are contributing online. You're giving to the life of the church. You're contributing prayers, thought, comments, online Bible studies. I started an online Bible study with a lot of you who are online, who can't physically, you don't live here. But yet you wanted to be a part of this congregation. This is the new reality, and that's a good thing. Number 6, in-person will become more personal. I like this one. The future is both deeply digital and deeply personal. For time's sake, I'm just going to rush through. You guys can search for this if you want to look this article up. It is excellent. Number 7, information will move online and transformation will move to in-person. I think this has to happen. Transformation does not happen online. We have to have the face-to-face, in-person, getting into the lives of people for true transformation to take place. Yet, we have the blessing of the internet where we can put information online, good information, solid information. We can reach people in ways that we can't without the internet. But transformation happens when you're in person. It just does. Number 8, location-independent church members will increase. The last few years have seen a mass migration of people out of cities, out of jobs they once held, and into new frontiers. There was this motto that once said, the future of the church is only urban, and so many churches put all their eggs into that basket of urban church, urban church. A lot of ministers, I have friends who are leaving rural churches and going to the cities because that was the future of the church. Guess what the trend is now? Polar opposite. Anybody look at the housing market in Somerset, in Berlin, in Holzapfel? Have you seen what the housing market has done? Anyone? Like, legitimate question. Have you seen what the housing market has done? The price of houses skyrocketed. Availability of houses plummeted. Who's buying the houses? Somerset County, if you look at the demographics, it's a declining county. People were moving out of the county, so what? Why are there no houses now? I could probably sell my house for double what I paid in 2008 right now. And I could sell it. I could easily sell it for probably $10,000, $15,000 more than what my asking price would be. And people are paying cash. Who's buying the houses? City people. People are coming from Pittsburgh and other cities, Baltimore. They're buying up houses like crazy around here. Why? They're tired of city life. What does that mean for rural churches? There is a massive opportunity. So location-independent church members will increase. Those who remain in church have discovered online church. A lot of these are rural people who moved out of the cities and they can't find churches, and so they discover online church. Actually, I just opened up the mail this morning. I had a thank you card from somebody who was going to be here, I think last week or the week before, 2 weeks ago, and didn't make it. For some reason, the travel plans didn't work out. And I got a thank you note. Thank you for your online church. Thank you for the abuse advocacy work that you do. There are people, this is Memphis, Tennessee. There are people from all over the place who are connecting with us as a body of believers. Many people that I don't even know about. This is where we're at as a church, and that is a great thing. Number 9, pastors will sense a diminished authority. I like this one because that power and the celebrity pastor movement and all this bizarre stuff is fading quickly. People are no longer putting up with that nonsense.
Just last week I saw the mega church from South Carolina, John Gray. He's in critical condition in ICU right now from an aneurysm. And he was young and was going gun-ho.
Yeah.
I mean, he was on Dr. Phil's show, you know.
Yeah.
But here he is. He's dying.
It's a good example. You know, there's this bizarre thing that started happening, I mean, many years ago. This was decades ago, where all the focus and all the power and all the work, you know, not all the workload, but a lot of the workload was falling on the shoulders of the paid, you know, the hired hand, the minister. And it created this bizarre culture of, hey, you know, again, combined with this, if you build it, they will come, kind of culture, where we started holding preachers up on this pedestal and saying, man, if we just get the most educated, the most charismatic, the best, you know, gifted speaker, the person who can do it all, kind of well-rounded, you know, the family with 2.34 kids and, you know, all this stuff. Like, we'll get the perfect candidate and we'll build a church around that. And it created this massive ego, and we're finding out now, you know, within the last few years, it created this massive explosion of abuse in the church, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, where these people thought they were king and really right next to being God himself, and where the whole church revolved around them, and they let people know it. You want to mess with me? Fire me and see what happens to the church. That was the attitude. And sadly, they weren't that wrong. You know, that the churches would crumble if the minister was fired or something happened. And we started to see this. There was like this domino effect where these mega churches that were once allegedly thriving, you know, it took one scandal with their minister and a lot of these churches closed their doors. And so there's this diminished sense of authority, which is a fantastic thing. Jesus did not run his ministry on the authority of man. He didn't. In fact, he flipped that on its head and he said, don't be like the Gentiles who lord it over the people. He lived a ministry of service. Number 10, the brain drain will become acute. Sadly, the last few years, I've seen many pastors step back, not just from their current church, but also from vocational ministry. This is creating the staffing shortage, but the quality of candidates is also proving a bit of a challenge. Perhaps a renewal and revival will increase intensity in the sense of calling the next generation has, but we're not seeing the fruits of that labor yet. So this is kind of a little bit of a negative one, and he's saying all these great minds, people who are really well educated, well versed in the Bible, we're seeing that really slip away. And there needs to be a coming back to that where, kind of paraphrasing him here and adding my own little twist here, he's saying we need to get away from the intellectual pulpit preacher and move to where we have a combination of both heart for service and biblical knowledge. You need the both of them. It can't be one or the other.
That's exactly what my thinking is. We are called to serve.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Number 11, the exit of uninvested investors. There's a recalibration in giving. So he talks about like smaller churches tend to have these big, you know, massive amounts of endowments and things that they're sitting on, and they're not doing anything with this money. And he said there's, you know, those investors are dying because they're kind of aging out. And so it's leaving these churches unfunded, and they have to figure out how to be really creative in the way that they give and use funds. And again, this is a positive thing. People are being reached. Missions are increasing. Benevolence kind of things, or service projects are being funded that didn't used to be. That money used to go into buildings, the physical grounds. Number 12, finally, less predictability. Again, I think this is a positive thing. I think predictability stagnates churches. It puts people in a comfort zone, and people just kind of hum along. So I want to give time to our text, which is in Acts chapter 19. And I want to look at one of the probably most underappreciated passages in all of the New Testament in regards to the church and the work of the church, and what was accomplished through what Paul did in thinking outside the box. Paul is in Ephesus. Ephesus was a... Charles, what's a good word to describe Ephesus? It was a conglomeration, hot mess of a challenge for ministry. It was a major port city. You had, and it was a hub. So you had a lot of goods in and out, a ton of wealth, a lot of commerce. You had people coming and going. You had transient communities, pockets of people within Ephesus who, they weren't really from Ephesus. They just kind of lived there for a time, and then they would pack up and they would move somewhere else. They kind of follow the money kind of thing. You had rampant paganism, which we see with the riot in Ephesus. Artemis of the Ephesians was the state god, the Roman god in the city of Ephesus, where people were absolutely, life centered around worship of Artemis. Hence the riot when Christianity became really popular in Ephesus. Paul became a prime target. You had a Jewish population that was hostile to Christianity. Keep in mind, not just their geographic distance from Jerusalem, but also just kind of communication being slow. Between Jerusalem and Ephesus, the Jewish people there, it was a challenge. And so, again, I mentioned this last week or the week before. Judaism in the first century had just come out of a period, 150, 200 years prior, where Judaism was on the brink of collapse, quite literally. The temple was completely overtaken by pagans. And then we had the big Jewish revolt. And you have the Maccabees, right, who fought this major bloody war to reclaim the temple for God, for Yahweh in Jerusalem. And so you can imagine when these pesky Christians come in and say, okay, the temple, not really needed anymore. Because this is the temple. And by the way, the Messiah has come, and he's ascended, and we're uprooting everything that you think you know about Judaism, and we're now Christians. So you can imagine how difficult and challenging it was just to minister to Jewish people in this time. But now it's this big blend of Jewish people and pagans. And so here's what happens. Just starting in verse 8. And he entered, that is Paul, entered the synagogue and for 3 months spoke boldly, reasoning and persuading them about the kingdom of God. But when some became stubborn and continued in unbelief, speaking evil of the way before the congregation, he withdrew from them and took the disciples with him, reasoning daily in the hall of Tyrannus. This continued for 2 years, so that the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks. Isn't this a fascinating strategy in the midst of a literal crisis? I mean, if ever you want to have a moment that kind of defines your ministry and puts you in survival mode, this was it. All these people turned against Paul. They're bad-mouthing not only Paul, but Christianity. They ran Paul out of the synagogue, and rather than Paul saying, you know what? Jesus said, wipe the dust off your feet, move on, go to the next place. Well, Paul kind of did that, but he did it in a really creative way. Paul wiped the dust off his feet, but he took the believing disciples with him. And so that goes to, in my mind, right away, that goes to, which one was it? Well, certainly this one. Hybrid church, would you say that this was a hybrid church that Paul started? I would say that's pretty hybrid. Mixing Jewish people and Gentiles, moving out of the synagogue and saying, okay, that's no longer going to be the center of worship. The hall of Tyrannus is going to be the center of worship. You know what English word we get from Tyrannus? Tyrant. It means absolute ruler. We don't know much about tyrant. The guy's, we don't know if it was his nickname or given name, but you can imagine, typically people got nicknames because of personalities. Paul moves into this completely pagan arena, and some manuscripts, it's not in our Bibles, some people have footnotes. It says, and Paul was there from, translating the times, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., the hottest time of the day when workers would go home, they would rest because it was too hot to labor. This was the time that Paul would go in this 5-hour period. Paul would go into the lecture hall of the tyrant, and he would just teach people. You want to talk about creativity and endurance and breaking out of that survival mode and thriving. Paul made Christianity thrive. And I want to jump over to chapter 20 real quick because I think this is really important. Starting in verse 17. This is when Paul comes back through this area. Paul leaves Ephesus. He goes back, on these other mission trips. And then he's kind of passing by Ephesus, but doesn't have time on his way to Jerusalem to go to Ephesus. So he calls the elders up to this little town right on the beach, right kind of near Ephesus. But he calls the Ephesian elders and he has this meeting with them. And here's how this is recorded. Now from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him. And when they came to him, he said to them, you yourselves know how I lived among you the whole time from the first day that I set foot in Asia, serving the Lord with all humility and with tears and with trials that happened to me through the plots of the Jews. How I did not shrink from declaring to you anything that was profitable and teaching you in public and from house to house. It's this hybrid model of church where Paul said, I'm not going to rely on the Jewish synagogue and to say, all right, I have my 1-hour window to come in and to really preach and to get in and get out, and then life goes on as usual for the rest of the week. In fact, that got disrupted, wouldn't you say? Definitely. This center of worship, this place, this house of worship, or place of prayer as the synagogues were called throughout the New Testament, it's gone instantly. Paul wasn't like, my goodness, what do I do? Do I find a new city? Do I find a new synagogue? I got to use the synagogue. I have to be at a synagogue. It has to be, Christianity has to be inside the four walls of this synagogue, or else it's not really church, because we can't really do church. Well, maybe we could do them in homes. We could do like a small group breakout sort of thing. But But really, if we want to grow as a church, we have to have the resources of the church and the money and the budget. And we have to have the pulpit up front and the Lord's table, centered up front. And if we don't have that, then what are we going to do? Paul didn't do that, did he? Paul said, I know. The tyrant, this pagan philosopher who owns this massive building, I see potential there. I'm going to talk to the dude and see if the tyrant will let me use his space for, the hours that people kind of wander away and people aren't working. It's too hot to really do anything. I'm going to see if the tyrant will let me use his space. For whatever reason, the guy let Paul use it. And use it he did. It became this training center for discipleship. But Paul didn't just meet there. Paul was meeting in the churches or in the houses too. Paul had no problem experimenting. Paul had no problem having this hybrid method. And so he says, I testified, you know how I lived. I taught you only things that were profitable for you. Times were tough, times are hard, but I kept doing it. Verse 21, testifying to both the Jews and the Greeks of repentance toward God and of faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. And now behold, I'm going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and afflictions await me. Now listen to this. But I do not account my life of any value, nor as precious to myself. What number was that? Hybrid church, we got that one. In person becomes more personal. Got that one. Nailed it. Information moves, well, not online, but to the lecture hall of Tyrannus, the tyrant. And transformation moves to in person. You know how I lived when I was with you. Location-independent church members will increase. All these little house churches cropping up all over the place. Pastors will sense a diminished authority. I don't know what's going to happen when I leave here. The only thing is the Spirit keeps saying you will be imprisoned and death is imminent. But I don't account my life for anything. At least for myself. Would you say Paul had a diminished sense of authority? I would. And the church thrived in this area. In fact, there's a young guy by the name of Timothy, you might recognize the name, who moved into Ephesus when Paul moved out. Paul trained him. Likely a lot of that training happened in the lecture hall of the tyrant. Timothy was trained, equipped, and kept that choo-choo train going. COVID is not the end of the church, not by any stretch of the imagination. Not for this church, not for any church, unless we decide that it's the end. All right, I got to stop there. I'm out of time. Brent will pick up with Job next week, and I thank you guys for all the input that you gave over the last few weeks. See you in a little bit.